Right. And welcome everyone to this Lunch and Learn. It's the final one in our accessibility series for this semester. And we're talking today about creating an inclusive classroom culture, specifically the human side of accessibility. And that is one of the reasons that I invited Dr. Sarah Carter to visit with us today to talk to us about accessibility, share her stories, share her passion, share her expertise in accessibility. And I am Laura Thompson. I am an instructional designer, specifically at Stanton, but luckily due to all of the Zoom worlds and internet, things like that, I am available across all of the campuses in the college. Today, we want to really focus in on a couple of goals for this Lunch and Learn. We want to talk about why accessibility matters. Why do we even care? What difference does it make, right? We want to be able to have that conversation. We've had some of those discussions over the course of this series, but it's always good to revisit that. And we're going to think about the importance of inclusive classroom culture. To start with, we do want to play a barrier bingo with you. So you will notice that there are 9 squares in front of you. Please type into the chat or feel free to unmute to let us know how many of these barriers have you noticed before, have you experienced? And if you have 3 in a row, you get to say bingo.
Can I have all 9?
You can have all 9.
Mega bingo, right?
Yeah,
I don't think we have any prizes, but
Is that a bingo, bango, bongo? I don't know. Terrific. Anyone
actually
else?
not surprising that everyone could have bingo, bango, bongo, because these are all pervasive issues that happen sadly across, across many different areas.
Anyone see one of these more than others? Just as a comment.
I would say, especially like our hybrid and online classes, videos without correct captions, the auto captioning from experience is terrible, and it can be really hard to follow if you don't correct that. And there's so many videos out there that are captioned, but not correctly.
We promised that we didn't put Charlene in there purposefully, but you couldn't be more right, Charlene, in that we are so lucky and fortunate that we don't have to rely on captions, unless, of course, we're watching like our favorite like British crime show. I'm really talking about myself. But that is something that we really take for granted. And it's with all these AI featured auto captions, we're like, oh, set it and forget it. So that's a really, really good point. Thank you for bringing that up.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So we'll go ahead and we'll move forward. We have noticed that the videos without captions, or at least without correct captions. And sometimes we try to use those fonts that are really pretty, but they're hard to read, or maybe the contrast is difficult with the background, so we can't really read the words against the background. The one also to point out in the bottom corner, required participation methods, all must stand or raise their hand. If there's differences in ability, physical ability, those might not be ways that everyone can respond. So we're looking at a variety of ways that we might find barriers for learners of all of our students, for any of our students as well. And that's why we'll move into talking about accessibility versus inclusion. So we were talking about accessibility, that's removing those barriers. We just saw those 9 examples of barriers, and we know that's not an exhaustive list, but we want to be able to remove as many barriers as possible to help individuals, our students, to learn. We want to allow all of our students access to information, to the content of our course, and to be able to be engaged fully. And we can do this, one reason is to be compliant with legal and technical standards, such as using the captions and the screen readers. However, bringing in kind of that human side of it, we move more into inclusion. We want it to be a welcoming environment. So it's not just making those accommodations because now we have to. So normally everyone else sits at these desks, but here's someone in a wheelchair who's over to the side because they don't quite fit with the seating arrangement. We don't really want to have, we're allowing them in the class, it's accessible, right? But they don't really feel included. So we want a supportive learning environment that emphasizes, this even emphasizes cultural awareness. So even moving beyond disabilities, we're thinking about all types of people, all types of students, all backgrounds, demographics, ages, that we are wanting to welcome into our classrooms. And this is facilitated through flexible teaching and through open dialogue. We really, really want to promote belonging. But when Sarah and I were talking about this presentation, she also had another thought about this accessibility versus inclusion. I'd love it if you'd like to share that, Sarah.
Yeah, absolutely. So as Laura and I were talking yesterday, obviously accessibility and inclusion, they are different things, if you will. But, the first thing that came to my mind through all of my experience is truly that intersection. And, in my mind, just because I'm an analytical thinker, I was thinking Venn diagram, and really, to me, at the marriage of accessibility and inclusion is really the heart, is that human-centric view of a student, right? And when you look at accessibility and inclusion, while in a lot of ways you do it for a targeted, group of students or targeted students in mind, what inherently happens is that every student benefits. And so when you look at these two topics, when you think about in the broader, whether this is taboo or not, when you think about the broader diversity and equity coupled with accessibility and inclusion, what it's really doing is just focusing on this human being who's a student and their success. And so that's really what Laura and I kind of have honed in on in our chat today. So, and I think, Laura, that really segues nicely into the next slide, that really, as we think about all of these things, what we'd like to have you focus on, because this can be sometimes a very daunting topic, a very daunting task, especially if you either haven't had experience with a student, you just, know about it, or maybe you don't know about it, and it can feel overwhelming. So while obviously it is the law that we have to do these things, what we want you to remember is that the reason why we do this is because of our students. Our tagline and our mission is we put students at the center of everything that we do. And this is just another extension of that, where we're just thinking about some of these, different students that have different needs, for no fault of their own. And so what the insight that we really want you, the lens by which we want you to kind of listen to this and participate in our conversation and move beyond, is that make it part of your conversation. Maybe you're part of a PLC or a part of a group or part of an outside organization, and they're talking about, as Laura said, they're using able-bodied language or coming up with these topics. Be the one to raise your hand and say, hey, did you think about a student who's blind or hard of hearing who might need this, consideration? And, be the voice, because as Laura and I were just talking about yesterday, so often with this area, it often has to be a grassroots approach. Many institutions approach this reactively because it's just not always on the top of the priority list. So, it's amazing that we have this group of faculty who, and chairs and other folks who can be part of the conversation. And this is how things organically evolve in this. So I could talk for hours. So Laura, cut me off, give me my little, song that I need to stop talking. But that's really what we wanted you all to think about as we go through this. Don't be overwhelmed. Think about the student, and that's all we're doing. And ultimately, when you have that student lens, it doesn't just help that one student that actually needs this, it helps everyone in your class. So
I really love when Sarah was mentioning for the closed captions for those British mystery shows. That's one that I've talked about before too, that they'll say these little things. And the neat thing is because they have the closed captions, I can see it then and I can look it up and see what does that phrase actually mean. So even if I get to understand what they say, sometimes they use some colloquialisms or something like that, that I'll look up so that I understand the idiom of the language, or I understand and I can participate better in, oh, the inside joke. So it helps me, even though I don't have a hearing disability necessarily, even though I'm 51, I don't know, maybe I'm getting there, but it helps me to be able to see that language as well. If we look into strategies for building this inclusive culture, then there's 3 that we'll focus on, although there are several. One is open conversations about accessibility. Another is supportive and adaptive learning environments. And then we'll also look at addressing student concerns with empathy. We want to start with those open conversations about accessibility and really starting by setting the tone early. And this is including an accessibility statement in your syllabus or in your course procedures. And each department should have that already that they're using. However, how often do we actually talk to our students about it? Do we point it out? Do we take a couple of minutes in class to say, by the way, here's some accessibility channels that I'm trying to employ for you? Well, when we were discussing it yesterday, that was one of the things that we had talked about, was how often these things, we put them there. They're there. Oh yeah, the students can find them, but we don't make it obvious for the students.
Well, actually that's, I was thinking of it, but didn't know if it was necessary. Like, and you all know as your faculty, students are going to do what you say and you guide them to. And I'll give a great example. I was in Dover last week and somebody stopped me in the hallway and said, is it like some holiday? Because my class isn't here. And I'm thinking, no, it's not a holiday. And walk away. I'm like, wait, it's spring break. And I'm thinking to myself, you know, I think we sometimes, because we're so immersed in the usual resources that we share, and we think that students are looking at the portal and all this stuff, they're looking at the syllabus, ha ha ha. No, they're not. And so the accessibility statement that's buried on the last page of the syllabus, they might not be aware of it. So, you know, bringing that to their attention and just kind of the intentionality, as Laura was mentioning, of just saying like, oh, hey, you do care about me. Maybe I haven't reached out to a disability counselor yet, but I know that I can. So, yeah.
Excellent. And you want to be able to use inclusive language. And we talked about inclusive activities where we're not necessarily saying everybody stand up when maybe we have someone who's not able to. And I do know that I have a variety of students in my class that I teach as an adjunct. And so sometimes I might have someone who maybe doesn't have an obvious disability, but has some difficulty standing up out of their chair. I don't want to sound ageist, but I already said what my age was. I mean, maybe even if it's just because your knees creak, you know, there's something to recognize that maybe you need an alternative way for people to participate. And that's, again, respecting that all learners in your classroom. And engage in active listening so that when your students are speaking to you, that you are letting them bring up accessibility concerns, you're listening with an open mind, you acknowledge their experiences, and then you work collaboratively for those solutions so that you're trying to work together to be able to find out those solutions. And you can provide flexible participation options, as we talked about, so that students can respond in different formats. One format that I like to recommend also is when we have our classes available in Brightspace and D2L, then we can continue a discussion in that format as well. A couple of reasons for that: we have students who might have language differences, who need to really think about what they would like to say in order to contribute to the conversation. If we have those discussion boards as an option, it doesn't have to be graded, doesn't have to be an assignment, but where that conversation can be continued, we increase the likelihood that all of our students will be able to participate. And this also helps your students who might have a processing delay, that it takes them just a little bit longer to really process what's going on in the conversation and feel like they can contribute in a valuable way in the in this discussion that we're having. So there's a few things to think about with those flexible participation options as well.
And Laura, you bring up like some really good points, and that is one of the great things. You know, there are some really good things about what happened with COVID, and then there's, you know, some really not great things. But some of the silver lining is, number one, bringing light to some of the inherent accessibility issues, especially related to digital accessibility. But Laura brings up a really, really good point that, you know, there are some students who, for whatever reason, whether it's a processing problem or you know, maybe they have a speech impediment, that the discussion board is safe for them and they feel more comfortable participating in that manner. So that's a, you know, and some of us even just are shy and we don't like, you know, speaking up, whereas others dominate the conversation, right? So I think that that is a really, again, another example that it supports students with disabilities, but it actually supports all students. And I want to go back to that, what Laura was saying about, you know, engaging in active listening. And if students bring up a concern, I actually used to be the disability counselor here at the college. And one of the things that we want to be really careful of, and you toe that line, is you don't want to say to a student, well, I think that you should really talk to the disability counselor. You know, you definitely don't want to be the one to start that. Now, if a student asks you questions, absolutely. Or as we mentioned in the past, if you bring it up to the holistic group, then the seed is out there. So I just want to, you know, and that's, obviously it could be common sense, but there are some people I think who feel like they would be helping, but that's not really necessarily a helpful approach, to just assume a student has a disability or might need that. So, and, you know, I'll just share another quick story that, you know, I have a friend who's a faculty member, and she texted me and she shared with me this situation that happened in a class where she used that kind of ableist language. And I'll be the first to say I use it too. It's part of our vernacular, right? You say sit, stand, high, you know, it's just part of it. And she felt so bad that she said this to her class, and she tried to address it with a student who was in a wheelchair. And she said to me, she's like, do you think that this was the right approach? And, you know, ultimately what I said to her was, the bottom line is that you cared enough and it was in the forefront of your mind to know that it happened, to address the issue, and to be like candid enough and open enough to say, hey, I messed up, show me how to make this better. And so I think that that's a really good story, that goes a long way to students, that shows that you care enough about what you're doing to include them in that conversation. So those are just some kind of real world examples as we talk about these open conversations, and they can be uncomfortable at times.
Thank you. And we want to talk about supportive and adaptive learning environments. And I know that, Sarah, you were just sharing information, but I wonder if you wouldn't mind talking about universal design for learning. I see you as an expert there, and I've learned so much from you about that approach. UDL, would you mind talking about that?
Sure, yeah. And many of you, if you've, you know, been part of anything related to CCIT, and again, another silver lining of COVID is that universal design for learning, or UDL. And I think I've been presenting on UDL for years now, and I've always thought to myself, why isn't this sticking? And I think one of the reasons why it doesn't stick for a lot of people is that it's hard to kind of think about how to put it into practice. And what UDL basically comes down to is it's an approach to framing your instruction to think about the uniqueness of each student. And so there are, you know, these three different means of, when you think about engagement, representation, and expression, but we don't necessarily need to get bogged down in the jargon, if you will. So to boil it down, what it means is that when you think about an assessment, kind of like we just talked about with a discussion board, are you giving that assessment because the construct, like the actual paper, really matters? Or is it the content that's in? Can they do a video and showcase their knowledge? In some respects, the construct itself does matter. So that's just a concrete example of assessment. Can students voice themselves in different ways that they participate in class? When you present material, instead of just giving students a textbook or an article, can you give them a video that's appropriately captioned? Just thinking about different ways that it's not just one like linear stream of information. And that's the most like Cliff Notes version of UDL. There are a lot more details to it, but we always like to think about it. There's a great book, which whenever I mention the book, I always forget the name, but it's the +1 approach. Can you think about one more way to show a student this concept? Or can you think of one more way that a student might be able to show you how they've learned this particular concept? So that's really what UDL boils down to. And thinking about accessible course materials, we could do an entire session, we could do an entire day based on this. And we like to look at the faculty 5 when we think about accessible course materials. And when you boil that down, you think about documents. And documents include, whether it's a PDF or a Word document or a presentation like a slide deck, whether it's Google or Microsoft PowerPoint. You think about your videos, as Charlene mentioned. It's not just enough to ask, is it captioned? Is it appropriately captioned? Especially for highly technical areas like the sciences and the maths and even, I see some allied health folks here, some really specific terms that they might spell wrong, right? Capitalization and grammar matters. When we read appropriate grammar. So thinking about that, thinking about colors and fonts. For those of you who've been at the college for a while, does anybody remember like the brick background that you could use in Blackboard for the buttons? Anybody remember that? I used to cringe when I saw that because I'm like, I don't even know what those buttons say, but people just loved, it was like, they're like flair. Let me put my tiger stripes or and we don't think about the inaccessibility of that. So that's just another great example of that. And even thinking about when you look at, Brightspace in your course, is it something, do you have consistency in your modules? Do you, make it easy for students to go through it? And again, that's for somebody that might need a screen reader. And that's also for somebody like me that just is going to be drawn to the heading. So without getting into too much detail, there are so many different things that we can think about in terms of accessible course materials that goes beyond accessibility. And Laura and I do have some resources afterwards that we can share with you. And again, this is where I think most people get overwhelmed thinking about how to make things accessible. But luckily, Microsoft now has where you can just open up the accessibility checker while you're working in it, and it tells you what's going on. And the one, of course, that I forgot is your alt text for images. And it's a big hot topic, especially when you have a complex graph or complex images. It's really hard for somebody that's sighted to think about how to describe that image to somebody that can't see. It's a real big challenge. And that's, again, opportunities where AI has just blown a hole in our ability to really strengthen that. And then finally, thinking about that, as we've said, because this is the human side of this, that supportive instructor to student relationships. And this is where, again, this is just good teaching, right? I mean, this isn't just about students with disabilities. Have you set the tone in that welcoming environment from the start so that students feel like they can bring something up to you? Are you approachable? Maybe if they have something going on in their lives, or maybe you have written something, maybe a link is inaccessible, or maybe they can't click on it because it's broken. Do they feel like you're going to bite their head off if you tell them, or do they feel like, oh, hey, no, they're cool, like, they'll let me know? Are you checking in with students to just get the temperature and make sure that they're okay? And those regular check-ins don't have to be just with the students. They can be looking at assessments and looking at what students are completing to know, like, whoa, they completely did not get this concept. And then also finally, just thinking about the feedback that you give. And this is another example, an opportunity for you to give feedback in multiple ways. Maybe you do have a deaf student or a student that's blind. You can give video feedback versus written feedback. There's a wealth of opportunities related to this. So I don't know, Laura, if you have anything to add to that.
I think that was wonderful what you had described, and that's why one of the reasons, for instance, for accessible course materials, we like to have something like the Getting Started module, something that's reliable for students that they can count on for finding that information. Then also being able to think about that supportive instructor-student relationships, we can move into addressing student concerns with empathy that way. And again, just to re-emphasize, actively listening, but also actively listening without judgment. So being able to give your full attention, being able to put aside any other tasks that you might have, and to listen fully to a student, but again, without those, as well as we can, without those judging thoughts in the back of our mind when they're presenting their side of the story or their dilemma. We want to ask clarifying questions too. So we don't want to just assume that we know what they're talking about. We want to ask, can you tell me more about what's going on? Or we want to ask them some questions so that we can fully understand what their experience is, without assuming that, oh, okay, well, I know you're blind and I know what it's like for blind students. So I just know what accommodations you need, without recognizing that maybe they have some different tools that they use. For instance, when I was getting my master's, I was a note taker in class for someone who was hard of hearing. Even though we had sign language being presented, she was not interested in the ASL because ASL is interpreted. It is not a direct translation. She wanted as close to the translation as possible. So I took notes for her. So even though we might think we know what a deaf or hard of hearing student needs, they might have a different preference, and it's good to ask those questions or to have those thoughts in our mind.
And Laura, that's a great, that was a recent experience I just had. Some of you know this, some of you don't. I recently just defended my dissertation, surprise, surprise, on digital accessibility. But there is a student who he's deaf, and he was really interested in hearing what I had to present, but he couldn't be there. And, here's somebody who I've devoted years to this research, and, the Zoom transcriptions, because they're auto transcriptions, that's not sufficient for him. And so I'm going to redo the presentation for him, because we thought about how do we get the interpreter there, but if the interpreter was there, they'd be pinned and it wouldn't be me. And so it would take away from me. So there's so many layers of things that we are so fortunate that we don't have to think about. So, Laura just brings up a really good point about even just thinking about it. And as she was talking, one of the things that I think it's really important for us to remember is for us to get curious. If we have a student, or, because maybe we have either a personal or professional experience in our lives, and the more that we can just get curious about, well, I don't know what it's like, but maybe I can do some research. And again, it goes the extra mile to yet again show that you're a human being and you don't know everything. You don't feel everything, but you're willing to go that extra mile for our students. So anyway.
Terrific. And we want to create those safe and supportive environments where we have those conversations, and recognize that some concerns might be personal. Now, I shared with Sarah that I'm teaching abnormal psychology, and I'm amazed at how many students will share in class, I have a diagnosis of bipolar, or they'll talk about, well, my therapist said, and it's really interesting to me because I tell them, when I was younger, we did not do that. We didn't have this more open sharing environment that we do now. But there still might be some students who want to share something with you that is more personal as far as what their preferences are, something like that. So offer to meet one-on-one, whether that's with Zoom or through email or for an extra 10 minutes after class, something like that, so that they have that opportunity to share it with you in an environment where they feel comfortable. But again, we're normalizing seeking help as well, helping to mention that some struggles are common or that resources are available. For instance, your office hours or your student hours, we like to call them, or when we have counselors who are available at the school who might be able to help, or if there are learning supports that are needed, talking about the tutoring center. I talked to my entire class about the tutoring supports that are available rather than targeting specific students. But being able to help them recognize that seeking help is possible, is okay, and looking at guidance and actionable solutions. Provide options instead of saying no extensions are allowed. Recognize again the human being who's in front of you, and we know that there are still limitations, there are still parameters that need to be set because it is a course, there's a time limit essentially, and that we need to be able to think about it. But as often as we can, developing that plan or having that flexible approach that we discussed already before, and helping students find the resources that are available. You as the faculty member, you can't fix everything. You can't handle all of it. So recognizing how you can help students find tutoring or recognize if they're asking those questions that would lead them towards disability services that they might attend there, or mental health support or academic counselors if they're expressing an overwhelming sense of they just have too many credits, then they can talk to their academic advisors as well about how do we adjust this? How do I manage all of these courses that I'm trying to take?
And
And
Laura,
then finally, oh
really
yeah,
quick,
please, Sarah.
back off, because as you were talking, of course, I have stories for days. I feel like a 90-year-old that I could just tell lots of stories based on my travels. But one of the things that came to mind when Laura's talking about this flexible approach, and I know some people, you might cringe thinking, well, I'm in a field where flexibility is, you can't, it's life or death, right? And you're thinking about different fields where students have to learn deadlines, they have to learn different things. And I think what's really important is that we're not trying to say that we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? We're not saying that deadlines aren't important and not teaching students soft skills along the way, right? But I think there is a healthy balance of that culture of caring, if you will, and that flexibility. And it also too, because I do see some, allied health folks in here, is that I remember, and I think, I don't know if we have these anymore, but we used to have these program requirements, if you will. And I would have folks when I was the disability counselor tell me all the time, well, don't worry, we don't need to know this because we'll never have a blind student we'll never have a deaf student, we'll never have this type of student in our class because they don't meet the minimum requirements of the program, requirement sheet, or I forget what they're called. And I think the bottom line is that in our able-bodied minds, we can never understand what's a little bit of flexibility, how far it goes. Technical skills. Thank you, Elaine. how far it goes. So even though they can't quote unquote do it in the normal, that they might need some sort of accommodation, we have to, if nothing else, flexibility might just mean that for us to broaden the scope of our mind. And I give this story, if you've heard me present before, my son Mason, he's got severe special needs, he's got a trach, so he often, not anymore, knock on wood, was in the hospital a lot and would have respiratory therapists left and right. And I will never forget, a respiratory therapist came in and she had one arm, and she was able to give him the gold treatment because she had things in place. And all I could think to myself, and I get the chills every time I tell the story, is that I bet that she was met with a lot of inflexibility, that somebody said, there's no way you could be a respiratory therapist or do this with only one arm. And she did it. And I'm sure it took a faculty member thinking bigger, thinking more flexibly to figure out a way that she can still do that even though she doesn't have 2 limbs. So those are the types of things that, yeah, exactly. An OT with no arms, right? Like we can't imagine being able to do that, but it is amazing, the perseverance. And so I think I just want to make sure that you all know we're not condoning that we're changing the rigor or the expectations of any curriculum. What we're saying is that we just need to think differently and think about, again, it goes back to the human being. And if we can make it happen, number one, because of the law, we have to, but we do it because, wow, what a great opportunity that is, that we're giving students this, you know, again, I'll use the word opportunity that somebody else might've told them that they didn't have, or we could never imagine because we haven't had to deal with those barriers. So sorry, Laura.
No, I
I'm gonna
really
regret that you
appreciate.
invited me for all my stories.
No, I think it makes everything richer, the whole experience. So thank you, Sarah, for your words. And finally, we want to talk about modeling empathy in the classroom culture. And Sarah and I, when we were talking about this, you see that listen, support, and guidance, listening, supportive, and guidance, those are the things that often happen with the instructor and the students, whereas the culture is going to be something that's a little bit broader, that's more representative of, for instance, how I'm behaving in the whole classroom with everyone. And using inclusive language, what I did see was an interesting example, and I'm a child of the 80s, right? So if we use phrases like, oh, that's so lame, that's actually ableist conversation. So when we say, oh, that's so lame, that's actually ableist. And I hadn't really thought about that before, that someone with physical disabilities who might have been called lame medically or in other biblical terminology even, that could be a term that is highly offensive, even though it's being used in a totally different way. So it's just being cognizant of the types of things that we might say. Archana, what did you want to say?
I was really touched with all the stories that Sarah shared, and these are all stories, and all of us might, come across these stories. But what I find challenging is to balance between this empathy and the rigid structure that is used as a guideline in number of quizzes, the course policies, and the rigidity of it. So how do you balance flexibility with this rigid structure?
Yeah, and I wish, I mean, I can only speak, I wish that I could say, Archana, that I had a magic bullet, that it's black and white, and it most certainly is not. And I think for me, it's situational. And I think a great example of situational is, there's been several ITN students to go through the program that are blind. And we're thinking, how do they do this? I mean, and even the folks who are in the ITN program are thinking, how do we do this? And so to your point, they've had to, and sometimes it's working with us, sometimes it's just working together as a group. And that's where those, I don't know if your group has done the PLCs, which are those professional learning communities, have gotten together and say, okay, we know we have our course evaluation measures menu, right? That as a college, we're agreeing to stick to, but I can tell you with 100% certainty that this college supports students. So if we came and said, there's a reason why they can't, let's say, follow the letter of the law to the course evaluation measures menu, right? So I think it's all about, to me, conversations, and really what it boils down to is, why are we giving that assessment? And to me, that is where it all lies, is that as long as we know that a student is still showing us that they've mastered the competencies of the course, the assessment, again, that construct, or do they really need all of that, or can we consolidate it? So I know that's a very gray skirting around the answer, but it really comes down to open conversations between your counterparts, between the other people. Maybe it's even, you find sister institutions that have had this. I know I belong to a ton of accessibility groups, and you can talk to people about what they do. There is no magic bullet. I mean, sadly, not sadly, maybe that's part of this is why, but that's a really great question. I think why this topic is overwhelming for a lot of people, because it's not just, yes, do this every single time. It's not like that. But as I said, this is recorded, I know this institution will support any faculty member, any chair who's trying to accommodate students. And I want to bring up something that Jake mentioned, because I think it's really important that these neurodivergent learners, and, you know, for those of you that might not be familiar with that term, a lot of times this is the new term, if you will, for folks with autism, and it doesn't necessarily capture the entire population. So I don't want to generalize, but if you haven't heard of that term, and when we talk about students with disabilities, this group is absolutely part of this. And, you know, in a lot of ways, we're all neurodivergent in how we learn, and that's why universal design for learning is the place. So yes, in terms of accommodations, Jake, neurodivergent students are serviced at this institution. And in fact, I know, again, going back to the ITN program, I know for a fact that there's a lot of students in that program, and whether that's they get extended time, or they have the opportunity to like get up and leave the classroom when they need to leave the classroom. There are different, and that's where, going back to, you know, it's all about a conversation. And I know none of our disability services counselors are here, but they'll be the first to tell you that the key to a successful accommodation plan is an open conversation. So Jake, I saw you unmute. I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I kind of did want to add to that. So not necessarily to the aspect or point of accommodations, but more of how we communicate with the students who are neurodivergent. A lot of the times, especially as they get older, those are disabilities that aren't normally seen, so that it's very often ignored. So I think I'm pointing more towards how you communicate with those types of students. You might have to communicate with them differently. They may ask the same question multiple times in different ways because they don't understand the answer that was given, you know, the first 12 times that they asked that question, which then results in, you know, an instructor or employee or employer getting frustrated. I think that maybe understanding that you might have to repeat or restate certain answers and information in different ways is something that needs to be, you know, put at the forefront of an instructor's mind.
And that's a really great, you're bringing up a couple of points that I want to address. So number one is that, you know, whether you're familiar with it, for whatever reason you're familiar with it, there are a lot of folks at our institution that have come from industry that they've never had to have the opportunity to engage with a student like that. And oftentimes people can feel uncomfortable because they could be socially awkward, or to your point, it's almost like they're deemed as annoying, right? And the instructor's like, I just told you that like 2 seconds ago, and I wrote it down and I posted it in here. And so I think as a college, we can step back and say, what can we do to support faculty to know how to navigate those conversations? Because just like in the example with assessments, you're not going to engage and communicate appropriately the same way, because each of us are unique. And so to your point, yes, there are different strategies, whether it's diffusing a student who might be disruptive, right? Because sometimes behaviors can be disruptive to other students. And so it's giving faculty the skills to figure out how to communicate. And you brought up a couple of great examples, and that's where technology is a beautiful thing, right? And it goes back to the open conversations. If a student, whether they have an accommodation plan or not, you as a human being are going to notice if a student is, and I don't want to use the word different, but if they have different behaviors. And so that's an opportunity for you to strike up the conversation and figure out what is the best way. What do they feel comfortable with? They've had to go 18 plus years to figure out a way to get to you. So they probably are well aware. If they have an accommodation plan, I would highly suggest, instead of just reading the plan, meet with the disability counselor, because the disability counselor is the one that is probably their go-to person, that you can, again, get curious about, how do I help this student? And so that's a really great point. And for me, it only takes me back to, we need to do some targeted training so that you all feel empowered, and you know that you have this toolbox that you can draw in to, you know, feel more comfortable and confident about supporting students that, you know, might approach things and just not out of anything other than that's just who they are, So that's a really great point, and I appreciate that you brought it up.
Thank you for that. And also, I mean, another aspect of building that culture is sharing your own learning challenges. But as Sarah and I were discussing, for instance, we think about the classic, I don't know, stereotypical elementary teacher who says, oh yeah, math is hard. Math is hard. I had a hard time with math. Math is always hard. Instead of actually sharing the way that you made it through your struggles and maybe exposing students to some strategies that they might be able to employ themselves to overcome some challenges. But sometimes it's just the idea of recognizing that here is this instructor who's the expert, and that we recognize that they did have some work that they were engaged in order to get to that level of expertise, and maybe that they still work through.
And Laura, I want to bring up, because I just saw Elaine's comment, and I appreciate that you put that in there, Elaine, and that is exactly why. So what Elaine said is that generally how it works is the accommodation plan kind of kicks something off. And a great example is that I would say one of the most common is extended time, right? Like, let's say you give an hour for an exam and a student has double time, so it's 2 hours. And so she's exactly right. And this is why universal design is important, because as an instructor, you need to think to yourself, is that hour really important? Or should I give every student from the start 2 hours? So while there are certain accommodations, like a note taker that needs to go through the accommodations office, there are some accommodations that, and this is Sarah's opinion, so I'll get on my soapbox. There are some accommodations that probably don't even need to be on that list, because as an instructor, if you looked at it and approached it from that universal design perspective, every student would benefit from it. And even the student that might not have ever walked into the disability services offices, whether for whatever reason, right, that they thought it was a stigma, that they don't even know that they have an anxiety disorder, or they don't know that they're neurodivergent, or what have you. I think that what this does is, again, it's an opportunity for you to reflect and say, why do I do this? I mean, sometimes time tests are because they're going to take this OT final exam and it's timed, and they need to know that, and that's okay. So that's a really great point, that there are quote unquote accommodations that are really just what Laura and I are talking about, that you can do for all students, which is what you would do for all students. And then there are ones that need to go through the disability services office. So thank you, Elaine, for bringing that up.
And finally, being able to encourage peer support also. And that's why I was talking about your behavior in the classroom also as a leader, as a keystone for the classroom, is helping students recognize the strength that they can have in each other and celebrating the strengths that each individual has. So rather than only looking at barriers that they face, recognizing where they have strengths and where they can bring those into, say, group activities or into group discussions, or recognizing really, even if maybe there's a physical disability, just how incredible their brain is. Having those kinds of discussions as well. And also, if you help encourage peer support, there's someone there after you, because you're the instructor now for this course, but then they have a network of support beyond you. So now, I love this though. We've had tons of conversations here. This has been fabulous. And we put this slide in here because we did want to ask you, what's one change you have made or could make to improve accessibility or inclusion? And you can even reflect upon those 9 barriers that we saw before. But what's something that you have done or that you could do to improve accessibility or inclusion in your setting?
So I can talk about one of the changes that I have made. And that, again, that learning movement came from the student. One time I was teaching cybersecurity and I was talking about hacking, and I said, well, there are black hat people and there are white hat people. And there was this black student in my class, and he goes, of course, the black hat people are the bad ones, the bad guys. And that was just, the light bulb moment. I'm like, words are powerful and we just use these. So I went through the whole course. We used terms like master slave. We used black hat, white hat. So these were not even the technical terms at that time, but I changed the whole vocabulary to primary and secondary rather than, master and slave and black hat and white hat.
Wow, you were really
Funny.
responsive.
Because it touched me. I mean, I never thought of it. We use these terms without even thinking.
I just literally before this was talking with our LMS admin, and we're talking about dev courses and master courses. And we were like, should we change it to primary? And I know for a while the colleges thought about blueprint versus, so again, that is on my list to talk about what do we call these courses that are like the final thing, so that we don't use language that is possibly going to, I don't offend, or just, you don't know how somebody, perceives that, right? So thank you for that example.
Are there any others to share? Anyone else?
I changed a lot of our assignments this year to videos where the students have the option of either writing a paper or submitting a video. Mostly, I mean, because of accessibility, I like that students have the option, and they like having the option what works best for them. But it's also to kind of battle AI and students just, putting instructions into ChatGPT and submitting that kind of work. So it's kind of worked both ways. And I think students really like it. They like having the option.
All those budding creators out there and influencers. Fabulous. Thank you so much for sharing those. I'd like to be able to show you this information. This was inspired by Sarah's Venn diagram comment, to be able to, again, just to reiterate the accessibility, recognizing accessibility for students, and thinking about inclusion, those welcoming environments, promoting that sense of belonging. And in a previous Lunch and Learn, I had talked about, it's kind of like getting an invitation to the party. That's accessibility. We get an invite. But being able to actually participate in the party and be a member of the party is inclusion. So we want to be able to support all of our students for their success in academics and once they go out into the world after us, helping to support those. Okay. This is a QR code. If you'd like to scan it, you could fill out the survey for us. You should also get one deployed to you when we finish this session. And we really do appreciate the feedback that you give us. We do read that feedback and we use it. And I'm in the throes of planning for the fall. So give us some ideas of what you'd really like to see, what would really interest you.
And if you don't mind, Laura, what I would add, and number one, I appreciate the openness, the conversation that you all took the time out today to join us. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart for a lot of reasons. But if nothing else from today, as we've talked about, just remember the students, and I know that you do. And this is, and it can be a lot of work to think about. But it ultimately goes back to our students, and that we want to see them earn that degree. And what I would say also about the survey, if you do take the time to submit it, some of the questions are related to like instructional strategy. So if you could think beyond an instructional strategy and maybe think about how accessibility can be improved. So while the survey might not be like a one-to-one, think about one thing that you can do. The other thing, as Laura mentioned, if you have ideas about training, Jake brought up that example. If you've had, a challenging situation or you overcame something, please email me directly, because I would love to hear these stories. And we want to support you all to make sure that you have what you need to feel like you can support all students in any modality, any situation possible. So we just really appreciate you taking the time, to learn with us, because we're learning too. And yeah, so thank you. And thank you for listening to my incessant stories.